Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone. In today's episode, we're going to be joined by Jordan Evans-Hill, creator and host of Inimitable, the Charles Dickens Museum's podcast. Jordan is a former footman from the royal household, where he served the late Queen Elizabeth II. He is also a writer, having recently completed his debut novel, and he works as the head of marketing and commercial at the Dickens Museum. Jordan and I have both worked together previously right here at 48 Doughty Street, filming some of my solo performances of Dickens's stories such as The Chimes, Sikes and Nancy, and The Signalman. In this special episode, this Tale of Two Podcasts, Jordan is going to take us on a tour inside the house where Dickens lived and worked as he completed Pickwick, wrote the entirety of Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby, and began Barnaby Rudge, which regular listeners to this series know is one of the best books that no one reads. It's time to begin. And as we journey through the house now, you can follow the Dickens Museum's online interactive tour. The link is in the description to this episode, where you can walk around the rooms virtually as we go. I can see Jordan now, standing in the doorway, ready to meet us.
So just through here now, we're entering from 49 Doughty Street, which is the main entrance to the museum, stepping through a brick wall essentially, and we're now in number 48 Doughty Street, the hallway. This is Charles Dickens's home. If you look behind us, you can see the front door that he would have used, complete with the original letterbox. And when you think how many letters that man wrote, you would have seen some action in its time. Gosh, when you step into this house here, you are literally in the home of Charles Dickens. This is where he made it. He first achieved fame here. So he moved into this house in 1837. He didn't stay here for that long. It was just under 3 years. He left in 1839, and he left for two reasons. Firstly, his family was growing. So when he moved into this house, he was newly married and he had one child. He left with three. They would, of course, go on to have 10 children altogether. Yes. So a fruitful marriage. When he moved in 1837, he was midway through writing the Pickwick Papers. That was coming out in monthly instalments. And that was really what earned him enough money to lease this house. He didn't own it. He leased it for £80 a year. Would you believe it? And he wasn't actually writing under the name Charles Dickens at that point. He was writing under the pen name Boz. He was still working as a journalist. So he's really at the very early stages of his career. While living here, he completes the Pickwick Papers. He also writes Oliver Twist. That's the story which really propels him to international fame. He follows that up with Nicholas Nickleby, and he began Barnaby Rudge here too. By the time he leaves in 1839, he's probably the most famous man in the country. So we always sort of say this is really his origin story. He moves in the relatively unknown journalist. He leaves the famous Charles Dickens.
Wow. So we're standing inside the dining room?
This is the dining room,
okay.
Yes. And again, what I always like to point out to people when they visit us here at the Charles Dickens Museum, I'm sure it's the same for both of our listeners. When people think of Charles Dickens, you immediately think old man, big bushy beard, not much on top, looking rather serious in a black and white photograph. When Dickens moved into this house in 1837, he was 24 years old. He's young, he's vibrant, he loved really flashy clothes, and what he really enjoyed was a good party. He surrounded himself with other people who were like him, young, ambitious, on the rise. He had other artists, writers, actors, quite a glittering circle of friends, and he loved to entertain. If you think about Charles Dickens' stories, all of them feature food quite predominantly. You think of A Christmas Carol, the big roast turkey, or you think of Oliver Twist, going up and asking for more gruel. Food is really important, not just in terms of wanting to eat it, but also in terms of that social status. It tells you, are you a rich person or a poor person based on what you can eat? And for Dickens, what he really loved was being able to share. So he loved to sit in this dining room, having a big party with his friends, offering them food, offering them drink. For him, it was a sign of perhaps his new status, but also a sign of conviviality and friendship. And you see that a lot in his works as well.
Yeah, I love the blue. It reminds me of one of those 12th cakes.
Yeah, it really feels like it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a celebratory room. It's not too large, actually, and it's got a slightly rounded wall on one side, which adds to the fun. In fact, the doorway coming in, the door itself is actually slightly curved. This is a Georgian building. I think it was completed in the early 1800s, so it would have been about 30 years old when Dickens moved into this house. And in fact, a lot of what you see belonged to Dickens. So, for example, on the side here, we've got a very large Spanish mahogany sideboard. It's very showy. It's got lots of kind of ornate decoration pieces to it. And Dickens purchased that for this room when he moved into this house. On one of the plinths, which is holding up the sideboard, it opens up and there's actually some lead-lined drawers in there, and that's to keep your wine cold. So this is essentially like having a minibar built into your dining room.
It's amazing.
And again, it just shows us that Dickens likes to party. He likes to entertain. Yep. We know there was one event in this dining room where he had 14 people gathered around for lunch. This is not that big a room. So if you think 14 people gathered here. So
that's the original sideboard. It reminds me of our mutual friend with that big mirror at the back, reflecting the guests.
And of course, Dickens had this, he brought it for this room, but he kept it for the rest of his life. So, whether or not he drew direct inspiration from it, who knows?
And I can see Mr. Pickwick above the sideboard there, a giant portrait.
Absolutely. And again, we like to sort of showcase Pickwick in this room because, the Pickwick Papers is the story which established Dickens as a writer. And as I say, earned him enough money to lease this house. This house was possible because of the Pickwick Papers. Dickens didn't come from money, as most people know. When he lived in this house, this is the first sort of significant house that he had lived in. None of his family had ever lived in a property as large as this. And he described it as a frightfully first-class mansion with wonderful responsibilities. So, for him, he knew this was a real step up in the world. When he started writing the Pickwick Papers in 1836, it was obviously sold in monthly installments, and he was selling about 400 copies a month, which is pretty good. I mean, most writers today would be pretty happy if they were selling 400 copies a month. By the time he finished writing Nicholas Nickleby, he was selling 40,000 copies a month. So in the 3 years that he spent in this house, his career just really took off. His rise was meteoric. And actually, if we look in this cabinet behind us, we can see some elements of that. So these are all dining equipment, basically. We've got sort of forks and spoons that have got little crests in the handle. Of course, in the Victorian era, you haven't made it until you can have your crest on your own spoon. And similarly, you've got a plate down here, which is just a large white plate. And at the top, it's got the little initial CD and a little lion which tops it, which Dickens kind of adopted as his crest. But in the middle shelf here, we've got some silver punch ladles. So they're very small ladles used for serving punch at his parties. And the little figurines are on the top of each handle. And these figurines are the characters from the Pickwick Papers. And these were gifted to him by his publishers when he finished the novel. And I dare say because he was becoming very successful, his publisher was pretty much saying, thanks for making us so much money.
Indeed.
We've also got this rounded wooden block with a handle on top. And this is actually a lemon squeezer. So one of Dickens's favourite drinks at these parties was rum punch. And to make it, you basically got a pint of rum, a pint of brandy, set fire to it and add a bit of lemon. And you'd use a lemon squeezer like this to make it. From what we know, Dickens was very fussy about how his punch was made, and he insisted on making it himself. He wouldn't let the servants do it for him.
That's the quarter.
The clock was originally in Gad's Hill in Kent. It's in the hallway now of Doughty Street, and it's lovely that it still works. I mean, you don't often get to literally hear the sounds of the past, but when you can hear Dickens's clock chiming, again, it's just quite a magical experience. But we're going now in here into the morning room. The morning room, so called because it's the room you use literally in the morning. If you think every Victorian home is lit by quite a small fireplace. So if you've got quite a large room, it's going to take quite a long time to heat up. And if it's the winter months, you really don't particularly want to sit in a cold room. So you have a morning room. It's generally quite small, which means it heats up fairly quickly and you can use it straight away after breakfast. The Victorians also have quite odd beliefs that some rooms are manly and some rooms are feminine. And the morning room here is the ladies' room. So this is where Catherine would have spent most of her time writing letters, running the household, receiving calls, all that sort of thing. Now, we have a large portrait of Catherine Dickens here. Really beautiful to look at. It's painted by the artist Daniel Maclise, a very well-known Victorian artist who was a friend of the Dickens family. But it's also a bit of a fib. Because if you look at this portrait, you can see Catherine Dickens, and she looks like the perfect Victorian housewife. She looks quite demure. She's not looking at you as the viewer. She's looking down at her lap. There's flowers in the background, which is obviously a sign of femininity. She's got some sewing in her hands. She's got a little thimble on her finger. So here she's everything a Victorian housewife is supposed to be. Now, Catherine is so much more than this. She's full of life. She loves to go to the theatre with Charles Dickens. In fact, she loves to perform theatrical performances with Charles Dickens. She loves to read. She loves to play. She loves to have friends over. She loves to entertain. She's a very good hostess. When the Dickens family go off on holiday to Italy, she goes with Charles Dickens to march up Mount Vesuvius at midnight so she can take in the views of the city. I mean, she's full of life in the 1830s and 40s. And this portrait, I always think, it tells you a lot about how she wants to be perceived rather than what she was actually like. If you like, it's an Instagram filter of the Victorian age. But my favourite thing about this portrait is the fact that it's called here at the bottom Mrs. Charles Dickens, because it depicts the wife of Charles Dickens. But in 1848, this portrait went on exhibition at the Royal Academy in London, and it was mislabelled as Mr. Charles Dickens, leaving some viewers to think they were literally watching Charles Dickens dressed as a woman for a theatre performance. So I love to think we've got some Victorian drag here at the Charles Dickens Museum.
She looks great.
She does, and she's very beautiful.
Yeah, she looks really lovely.
She actually does, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Now, those of you listening to this podcast will have noticed there's a change in the acoustics now in this room. So we've just come down into the basement level. This is, of course, the servants' domain, and we're standing here in the kitchen of Doughty Street. Today it's quite a quiet room. It's quite cold actually down here, but this really would have been the beating heart of the house when Dickens lived here. He had 4 servants in this property, certainly by the time he left. And this is not only where food would be cooked, but it's also effectively the staff room. So it's where they would take all of their meals. You'd have deliveries coming in off the street there. Big buckets of coal, big buckets of water. You can think this is a real room of industry. There's a couple of features in this room that are not quite accurate, however, and I'll point them out for you. First of all, we've got this large Victorian cast iron range, beautiful piece of equipment, but really this comes from later in the Victorian period. When Charles Dickens lived here, this would have just been an open fireplace and everything would be cooked directly onto the flames. We've also got a water pump. Now, Dickens did have a tap here at Doughty Street, and in fact, what really marks this property out as being a middle-class property is the fact that it's got its own water source. But his tap was not in the kitchen, it was found in the garden. It was switched on for 2 hours a day, and you had to get all the water you'd need for your cooking, your cleaning, your laundry, everything within those 2 hours. Now, water supply was not great in the Victorian times, and we have lots of letters from Dickens where he's complaining that the water's not been switched on time or not enough water is coming through to complete all the tasks they have to do. It's also true that the water was notoriously bad in the Victorian era. For example, if you were pumping your tap and you were pumping water into your bucket, it could be that a fish would plop out into your bucket. That's great, that's your dinner. But if you were less lucky, it could be human waste coming through your water supply. And we know there were several outbreaks of diseases such as cholera in the Victorian period, which were later traced back to coming from polluted water sources. So we're just heading up to the first floor now. Doughty Street, it is quite a large house because it's over 5 floors, but really it's only 2 rooms on each floor. I'm just going to get my breath back a second before I do the study.
Please.
So we're now walking into what has got to be the most important room in the house. This is the study. This is where Charles Dickens worked, where he wrote, and really, when you think about it, this is literally the room where he wrote Oliver Twist. It kind of gives you goosebumps to think about. When I'd not long started in this job, we had an exhibition on Oliver Twist, so I thought, right, I must reread the book. And there's a scene where little Oliver is brought up to meet Mr. Brownlow. And Dickens describes Mr. Brownlow's study. He says, a small room at the back of the house overlooking a little garden. And I thought, he's literally describing this room. Now, I don't know, you can't prove that he was, but you look at the geography of this room, it's a small room at the back of the house overlooking a little garden. So you really get this idea that Dickens is sat in this room writing away, and he's just describing the room that he's sitting in. And it's almost like he's sitting here imagining little Oliver coming through the door. It's almost like he's putting himself in the novel. And that's what's really remarkable about this museum generally. When you're here, you're literally stepping into Dickens's world and almost stepping into his stories. You can see here as well, we've got a desk and a chair. This is the writing desk that Dickens used. It was used later in his life, so it wouldn't have been in this room. It was used in his later home, Gad's Hill. But at that desk, he wrote parts of Great Expectations, The Tale of Two Cities, Our Mutual Friend, and his final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Now, Great Expectations is my favourite of Dickens's novels, so the idea of him writing it literally at this desk is just incredible. And you can see that it's a well-worn desk. It's something that's been used. I mean, it's interesting because to us today, this is our most prized possession. This is literally Dickens's writing desk. It's incredible. But for him, it wasn't a priceless item. It was a piece of useful furniture that he had to use. And you can imagine him kind of slouched on it, leaning on it, writing, dropping his quill, spilling his beer, doing all the things that people do today at their desks. It's a functional piece of equipment. But at that desk, he wrote some of the most famous stories in English literature. You can see behind us as well, there's a portrait of Charles Dickens, and this is the Dickens that we're all much more familiar with, the older Dickens with the big bushy beard and the kind of rather scraggly hair, and he's sitting in this very chair in front of this very desk. So it's a really beautiful way of contextualizing it, bringing it all together. And in this portrait, Dickens is surrounded by rather swirling characters, and these are all the characters from his novels. So if you look just by his knee, you can see Miss Havisham in her famous wedding dress, which she never takes off. At the top, you can see Oliver Twist kneeling before the Beadle Bumble. And right at the top there, you can see Scrooge encountering the ghost of Jacob Marley. Now, this portrait, it's not finished. And in fact, you can tell it's not finished. Charles Dickens is in colour, and a couple of the characters above his head are colourised. The rest of the portrait is kind of a parchment cream colour with a pencil black sketchings of the other characters. Originally, it was meant to be entirely in colour, but the artist died midway through producing it, so it was never completed. But the fact that it's called Dickens's Dream, you look at it now, you really get a sense of it as being quite ethereal, being quite dreamlike. So I think the fact it was never finished really adds to its quality. So this is the drawing room of Doughty Street. It's one of the larger rooms in the property. And what's really lovely about this room is it's decorated as close as it can be to when Dickens lived here. When he moved into Doughty Street, he left a series of letters in which he requested certain things be done. So we know how it looked when he lived in this house. For example, we've got a marble hearth in front of the fireplace that was installed for Dickens when he moved into this house. It's got a fully fitted flowery carpet, which, kind of reminds me of my old grandmother's carpet. But this would have been the kind of absolute height of fashion in the 1830s. Up until then, they would have just had kind of a rug on a wooden floor. So having a fully fitted carpet was really the height of luxury in the 1830s. He also requested that the doors and the skirting boards were painted pink. And you can see that these have been painted in kind of a blush pink colour. Pink was actually considered a manly colour in the 1830s. It was considered an offshoot of red and therefore was quite masculine. If you wanted a feminine colour, you'd go for blue. So we've done full circle since then. We've got some really lovely items in this room as well, most of which were owned by Dickens. We have a large red leather armchair here, really beautiful piece of furniture, and this was owned by Dickens. In fact, he owned it just before he moved into this house, but he obviously used this chair in this room when he lived here. And there's a small illustration on the wall which shows a young Charles Dickens sitting in this very armchair in this corner of the room. So again, we've kind of captured it in the moment. The illustration is done by George Cruikshank, who did the illustrations for Oliver Twist. And it's really interesting. People loved to come and visit the Dickenses. Dickens was a very gregarious man. He was very charming. People talk about kind of the room lighting up when he walked into it. He could have people in stitches. He was very, very witty, very, very funny. But the reason people would love to be invited to dinner with the Dickenses is that after dinner, they would gather in the drawing room, and Dickens would often read out his stories to his guests. And quite often, he would read out that which he'd been writing that very morning. So you'd be getting this exclusive insight into Dickens's stories before they've gone to publication. But the most really unusual feature in this room is this large glass cabinet, and underneath the glass is what looks like a rather strange table. It's about waist height, and it's covered in red velvet with a little piece of kind of red velvet trimming. This is actually Dickens's reading desk. Now, Dickens loved acting. He loved to perform. In fact, long before he became a writer, he didn't set out to become a writer. He originally wanted to be an actor. He kind of almost fell into writing. But his love of the theatre and his love of performance never left him. So even after he became the great Charles Dickens, the famous writer of Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol, he always had this real desire to perform. So in the 1840s, he decided, initially for charity, to go around and do a series of reading tours where he would go into theatres and he would read out from his novels. And originally, of course, people would expect a sort of middle-aged man to just come and read from his books. But that wasn't good enough for Dickens. He wanted to really perform and showcase his tales. So he designed this reading desk himself. And what it meant was that his whole body would be on show. People could see his legs, they could see the whole of his form. And that meant he could change characters very quickly. That meant that he could go from being Bill Sikes to being Nancy. And in fact, his favourite scene to perform was the murder of Nancy from Oliver Twist. He loved the drama of it, the sheer melodrama, the passion. We have a series of what we call prompt copies of his books, which are basically copies of his novels, which Dickens has defaced. And he's kind of scribbled out all the bits he's not going to read, and he's highlighted some of the bits that he wants to read, and he leaves little annotated notes for himself. And one of our copies of Oliver Twist, just before you get to the murder of Nancy, in big block capitals, he's written, "Murder coming." So you really get a sense that Dickens is playing with the audience. He's winding them up. He's building the suspense in the room. And indeed, Dickens has his own way of measuring how successful his performances were, because women would faint watching him perform. They probably did faint, but he could pack a theatre of up to 10,000 people. The theatres would be heated with coal fires, gas lighting. The men would all be smoking pipes. The women would all be wearing corsets. It's not hard to imagine why the ladies were fainting. But to Dickens, it was the sheer power of his performance. So this room has got really one of the sadder stories when it comes to Charles Dickens and his time here at Doughty Street. It's called the Mary Hogarth room for the very simple reason that it was the room used by Mary Hogarth. Mary was the sister of Catherine Dickens, and she came to live with them here in the 1830s. It's very common in the Victorian age, when you got married, if you had a younger sister, quite often they would come and live with you, partly to help you out. If you think to be a housewife in the Victorian age, it's actually quite a daunting job. You've got to be able to run a home. You've got to be able to run staff and pay staff and order provisions. I mean, you have to have the same skill set as running a business. So quite often you'd bring a younger sister with you who could help you with those jobs, help you raise the children if there are any. And also the idea was that the younger sister herself would kind of learn the ropes, as it were, so that when she got married, she would have some skills in running the home. It's also true that Mary Hogarth would, of course, been expecting to find a husband herself. And by being in the home of Charles Dickens, she was going to encounter all the great and the good of the age, all the most eligible bachelors in London. So she had a much better chance of getting a decent husband at her brother-in-law's house rather than in her father's. So she came to live here with them in the 1830s. The evidence is of a very, very happy family. Charles, Catherine, and Mary all got on extremely well. It's also one of the less known and less acknowledged facts is that Dickens himself struggled with his mental health. There's lots of accounts of him suffering from what we would now call depression. I mean, he wouldn't have called it that, but suffering from lows. In the 1830s, he talks about having a dose of, as he calls it, God knows what in the head, which just made it very difficult for him to write. And again, Mary seems to be quite a support for him during that time. So she's quite an essential part of the household. Only a few months after moving in, however, they'd all gone off to the theatre in Covent Garden. They came back quite late. They had a late supper in the dining room downstairs, and clearly they were having fun because it was 1:00 in the morning by the time they went to bed, probably wobbling up the stairs slightly. But when Mary Hogarth came into this bedroom, they heard her cry out and hit the floor. They put her to bed. They called the doctor out straight away. And in the following afternoon, she died. She was 17 years old, and she hadn't been ill. So they really had no idea what had killed her. Nowadays, they think it was a brain aneurysm. But of course, there was no way of knowing that in the 1830s. Now, because she had played this really important role, both for Catherine and for Charles, it was really difficult for them to cope with her loss. Dickens famously has a very almost flamboyant reaction to her death. He takes the ring from her finger and wears it for the rest of his life. He talks about dreaming of her. He talks about wanting to be buried next to her. He keeps her clothes for quite a long time. Because of this very extreme reaction to her death, some people have kind of speculated? Was there sort of more to their relationship than meets the eye? To be honest, though, I think that's really a modern mindset looking back at the past. What's more accurate to say is that Dickens felt responsible. When Mary came to live with him, he really would have seen her both as a sister, but also someone for whom he was responsible. And because she died under his roof, he felt that he had failed her, that he had allowed her to die. And it was really that feeling of guilt, I think, which prompted his extreme reaction to her death. What he did decide to do, though, is to do what only a writer can do, which is to write her story into his own novels. So, for example, when you read Oliver Twist, you encounter a character called Rose Maylie. And Rose Maylie is young, she's beautiful, she's 17. She turns out to be Oliver's maternal auntie in just the way that Mary Hogarth is the auntie of Dickens's own children. Rose Maylie is Mary Hogarth. And in the story, she falls ill. And Dickens describes Oliver Twist, this young child, pacing back and forward. He describes kind of the agonies of the soul when you can see someone you love, their life is hanging in the balance, and you can do nothing to help them. And when you realize that that whole passage is written based on his experiences in this very room, it really brings a whole sense of poignancy to that point in the novel. However, Rose Maylie recovers in the book, and Dickens writes the happy ever after that he never could give Mary Hogarth. So this room is the master bedroom. So this is the bedroom that Charles Dickens would have shared with his wife, Catherine. And in fact, two of his children, both of his daughters, were probably born in this room. So it's really an important time in the Dickens family history. There's some really lovely items in this room. So we've got a large wardrobe. It's a mahogany-looking wardrobe with a very full body-sized mirror installed in one of the panels. And I love looking into this because we know that with Charles Dickens, when he was trying to form his characters, sometimes he'd get a little bit stuck. And so he'd go and look in a mirror and he'd act the character out. And he'd watch how his face moved and how his body moved. And that's really how he could create such descriptive narratives within his stories. We've also got, of the more unusual items in this room, what looks like a plain wooden chair. But in fact, the lid lifts up and there's a chamber pot inside. So this is a commode that Dickens used later in his life. I've no real idea how and why they kept his toilet. Interestingly, we don't have much of his clothes. There's kind of quite large amounts of things that he owned that has been lost to history, but somewhere along the lines they decided to keep his toilet. So who makes these decisions? I'm not quite sure. So over here, we take a look at the Dickens marriage. Charles and Catherine Dickens had been happily married. In fact, they were married for 22 years in total. And then in 1858, they separated. There's lots of different reasons for it, as there is for every marital breakdown. But in a long story cut short, Charles Dickens had been having an affair with an actress called Ellen Ternan. In this article here, which we can see from Household Words, the magazine that Dickens edited and was in charge of, this article, Dickens publicly announces that he has separated from his wife. Now, this was scandalous. In the Victorian age, people didn't really do separation. Lots of people did separate, but usually they would just quietly go and live in different places. It's very unusual for someone to publicly announce that they've broken up with their wife. The question is, why does he publish this article? Well, Charles and Catherine had been living in Gad's Hill in Kent with Catherine's sister Georgina, who had come to live in the home as a support to Catherine. And she'd lived with them for 15 years or more. When Charles and Catherine broke up, Catherine was told to leave the family home, but Georgina stayed living with Charles. Now that's a bit weird. It's a bit weird to us today. It was a bit weird to the Victorian audiences. And nobody knew at the time that Dickens was having an affair with Ellen Ternan. So everyone assumed he must be having an affair with Georgina Hogarth, his own sister-in-law. Now that wasn't just scandalous, that was illegal. If you were having an affair with your in-law at that time, it was regarded as incest. So Dickens literally could have been arrested if people believed that that was true. It's a very dark moment in their life. Georgina had to submit herself to a virginity test to prove that she wasn't having an affair. And this wasn't just gossips talking, this was newspapers printing stories about his marriage. One Scottish newspaper not only said that he was having an affair with Georgina Hogarth, but that she had given birth to 3 illegitimate children by him, all of which was a total lie, but it was a damaging lie. Dickens, after all, even today is seen as the writer of Christmas, the writer of Hearth and Home, the writer of family values. The idea of him shacking up with his sister-in-law and having illegitimate children by her was hugely damaging. So really, This article that you see here is damage control. This is a PR move on Dickens's part in which he condemns the malicious gossip that's being spread about him. I'll read a little extract. By some means arising out of wickedness or out of folly or out of inconceivable wild chance or out of all three, this trouble has been made the occasion of misrepresentations most grossly false, most monstrous and most cruel, involving not only me, but innocent persons dear to my heart, and innocent persons of whom I have no knowledge, if, indeed, they have any existence, and so widely spread, that I doubt if any one reader in 1,000 will peruse these lines, by whom some touch of the breath of these slanders will not have passed, like an unwholesome air. Dickens was very angry when he wrote this. And of course, it worked in the sense that the newspapers stopped gossiping about him and Georgina Hogarth. But of course, although he could condemn the gossip, and although he did in the strongest possible terms, he was forced to admit that yes, he had domestic troubles and he and Catherine had separated. That in itself was scandalous. Indeed, there's another letter here to Dickens's friend Angela Burdock Coutts. He had co-founded a charity with her. They were very, very close friends. Catherine had actually asked Angela to mediate and to try and help repair the marriage before they officially broke up. And in this letter, Dickens is writing to Angela, really saying why he feels he has to leave Catherine. It didn't work. Angela resolutely came down on Catherine's side and in fact pretty much booted him off the charity they had co-founded together. But the other impact of this whole affair was the relationship between Catherine and her sister Georgina. We don't think there was a romance there. You know, Georgina may have had a bit of a crush on Charles, but certainly there was no physical intimacy between them. Needless to say, though, Catherine did feel very betrayed that her sister had pretty much decided to side with her ex. And when Catherine died, many years later, she left this ring on display. She left this ring to Georgina Hogarth. This ring is in the shape of a snake. Make of that what you will.
Gosh, well, on that bombshell, it's good to know that if you mess with Catherine, there are consequences. Jordan and myself will be back doing another joint episode in a few weeks' time where we sit down, I think, in the morning room, and Jordan talks about his perspective of working here at the museum, and I talk about my experiences of bringing adaptations to perform here too. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much and see you next time.